Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending this lecture on the Indus Script or Harappan writing system. Before I begin, I would very much like to thank Andreas Stouter and Samra Zarnush of ILARA, Institut de Langues Rares, for inviting me to present my research on the archaeological media and contexts of the Indus Script. This is a true privilege, and I will do my best to honor this occasion. Today, I will talk about some specific aspects of my research, which mainly involve the study of the administrative technologies of the Indus civilization and its craft productions, combined to reconstructing the organization of the Indus long-distance external trade. I am an archaeologist mainly interested in the study of ancient material culture and its socio-technical significance across cultural boundaries. And this is the perspective I will bring to you this evening. Accordingly, the presentation will be divided into 5 main sections. To contextualize the specific topic of this talk and to introduce some key concepts that will recur later in the talk, I will first outline the main cultural and ideological foundations of the Indus civilization, with particular attention to urbanism, social organization, and visual culture. I will then briefly discuss the origins and early development of the Indus script, from late 4th millennium proto-writing practices to its formalization in the early 3rd millennium BC. Building on this background, I will present the main structural features of the Indus script, the number and visual characteristics of the signs, their general statistical frequencies, positional patterns, writing direction, etc. The central core of the presentation will focus on the different types of inscribed media in the Indus civilization, paying particular attention to the so-called standard stamp seals, which constitute the great majority of Indus inscribed objects. Finally, I will briefly discuss the ongoing debate on whether the Indus script did or did not encode a language or languages. While Bronze Age cultural developments in regions like Egypt and Mesopotamia are generally sufficiently well known to allow us bypassing a general introduction, unfortunately, this is usually not yet the case for the Indus civilization. So, please allow me a brief introduction that will provide you with the historical context of my presentation. The Indus civilization or Harappan culture developed along the Indus River basin and the neighboring regions in present-day Pakistan and northwestern India, the so-called Greater Indus Valley, in the second half of the 3rd millennium BC. The Indus civilization was therefore contemporaneous with the Old Kingdom and early Middle Kingdom in Egypt, and with the early dynastic III, Akkadian, and/or III periods in Mesopotamia. The discovery of the Indus civilization was revealed to the international public 100 years ago by Sir John Marshall, then Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India. In 1924, Marshall claimed that he still had no precise idea of the date of this culture. However, the proto-historical chronology of the Indus civilization was soon established by different scholars based on parallels with better-known sites in Mesopotamia and Iran, which yielded Indus-style artifacts. After Marshall's large excavations at Mohenjo-daro, the Indus civilization entered the history of humankind. Scholars like Gordon Childe immediately highlighted its particularities, including the apparent absence of conflict, the lack of emphasis on military, political, and religious powers, an original cultural trajectory that evidently diverged from what was then known about the early Bronze Age socio-cultural, political, and religious developments in Egypt and Mesopotamia. However, and very unfortunately, early interpretations of the Indus civilization were strongly shaped by diffusionist ideas. Scholars like Mortimer Wheeler were convinced that Indus urbanism must have originated in Mesopotamia and merely transferred to the Indus Valley through population movement. Later excavations and radiocarbon dating clearly demonstrated that its development was entirely indigenous and deeply rooted in local prehistoric traditions. In fact, we now know, without any possible doubt, that the development of such an advanced urban society during the early Bronze Age represented only the culmination of an indigenous cultural tradition rooted in the local Mesolithic and Neolithic periods. The Indus civilization resulted in fact from a long process of coherent selection, synthesis, diffusion, and eventual crystallization of specific cultural traits from different regional cultures spread across a vast and highly differentiated territory. As anticipated by Gordon Childe in the 30s, later research has confirmed the original nature of the Indus civilization, which evidently developed a cultural trajectory quite different from that followed by the contemporaneous state-level societies in Western Asia. The Indus civilization invested primarily in urban structures and civil engineering rather than in religious or funerary buildings. Indus cities were organized around several independent walled compound seats of coexisting groups of authority. These compounds appear to have operated as semi-autonomous entities whose architectural choices reflect mutual emulation and competition. This configuration aligns with a hierarchical socio-political model, in which different elite groups alternated prominence and contributed to the long-term shaping of the urban landscape, focusing on infrastructural stability and civic functionality rather than on monumental religious or funerary architecture. In stark contrast to other contemporaneous urban cultures, excavations at the Indus civilization sites have yielded only a few hundred very simple burials. Given the large populations that must have inhabited cities such as Harappa and Mohenjo-daro for nearly a millennium, these small cemeteries likely represent only a limited and possibly secondary segment of the Indus society, while the majority of the population was probably cremated and their ashes dispersed. Indus tombs included modest grave goods in contrast with the lavish quantities of gold and gems found in the royal tombs of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Of course, this does not mean that the Harappans were not capable of producing precious objects. On the contrary, they were extremely skilled and innovative craftspeople, and some of their productions were highly desired across Western Asia. Actually, a considerable amount of the carnelian beads found in pre-dynastic and Akkadian royal tombs was made by Harappan beadmakers, either in the Indus Valley or directly in Mesopotamia. The Harappans simply chose to keep their wealth in circulation rather than bury it with their dead. Moreover, as far as we know, the Harappans never developed an anthropomorphic pantheon. Instead, sacred trees and vegetal elements seem to have played a central role in the Harappan religious beliefs. These beliefs are reflected in the archaeological record, also in the apparent absence of urban temples. At present, there is only one building at Mohenjo-daro that is tentatively interpreted as a temple. And, even in this case, it appears to have been built around a sacred tree surrounded by a round enclosure. Indus ideology did not support the representation of warfare with only one illustration of armed individuals, nor it reinforced political and religious powers through statues. Complex narrative scenes are also rare. In the Harappan world, visual narratives were limited to simple mythological and ritual scenes carved on small stamp seals. And, of course, we have the writing system. In the Indus civilization, writing apparently had very specialized uses, and we have no reason to believe that it was ever used to write longer narratives or propaganda texts. The invention, development, and eventual sharing of a writing system was, indeed, one of the most significant elements of cultural, socio-economic, and political cohesion among the different regions involved in the Indus phenomenon. As soon as the Indus civilization began to disaggregate as an integrated political and economic system in the first centuries of the second millennium BC, the iconographic corpus identifying the ruling elites, including the writing system, was suddenly abandoned and fell into oblivion. This highly specialized use of writing in the Indus civilization was, of course, the result of a conscious decision to follow an independent and original cultural trajectory. The Harappans, in fact, were well aware of other writing systems, as testified by the discovery of some Indus-type seals with inscriptions in Sumer-Akkadian cuneiform and linear Elamite. During the second half of the third millennium, evidence for the use of the Indus script is recorded at hundreds of sites in the greater Indus Valley, but also in other regions of Western and Central Asia, including the Iranian Plateau, the Oxus River Basin, Eastern Arabia, the Persian Gulf, and Mesopotamia, testifying to the intense commercial and cultural interaction with these regions. The process towards the invention of the Indus script began around the mid-4th millennium BC, when regional communities developed converging paths toward increasing cultural complexity based on conceptually comparable but still distinct material foundations. Superregional interactions for the optimization of raw materials procurement and the exchange of commodities eventually led to the selection, synthesis, and eventual assimilation of specific cultural traits from regional areas throughout the greater Indus Valley. One of these shared cultural traits were the so-called potter's marks, single signs traced on pottery containers before their firing. Unfortunately, information on this phenomenon is scarce and discontinuous. However, where data is available, as in the case of Murgar in central Baluchistan, they appear to have been linked to the local mass production of ceramic containers. At Murgar, the potter's marks were always single signs traced on pots that were not used as storage containers, but were mainly canisters or saggers used to protect and control the firing of small vessels. This evidence excludes the possibility that these particular marks indicated, for example, the capacity of the vessels. Rather, based on the evidence from a large accumulation of vessels discarded after a failure in the firing process, the excavators proposed that they were used to temporarily identify ownership during collective firings. In this phase, the meaning of such marks, the univocal identification of ownership, was therefore temporary and remained valid only for the duration of a particular firing event. This interpretation seems to be supported by the evident reduction in the number and eventual disappearance of the potter's marks between the later phase of Murgar and the earliest phase of the nearby Harapan site of Nashiro, when a new type of kiln for pottery, similar to the one shown in this slide, was introduced. This confirms that such marks were tied to specific operational circumstances rather than to permanent information about later vessel uses, and helps clarify their role within proto-writing developments. While at most sites the use of these marks remained restricted to pottery containers, at others they began to be engraved on seals as well. This button stamp seal in ivory from Raymondari, in northwestern Pakistan, has different animals and geometric signs engraved on the two sides. All such signs, both the animals and the geometric designs, also appear in the corpus of pre-firing potter's marks discovered in the pre-Indus levels of the site. This overlap illustrates the conceptual transition linking temporary production marks, post-firing graffiti, and early seal inscriptions into a continuous technological and cognitive trajectory leading toward the later script. The same cultural process can also be observed at Harappa in Pakistani Punjab, as at Murgar and Raymondari. Also at Harappa, stamp seals and potter's marks were introduced in the second half of the 4th millennium. However, while the phenomenon is comparable, the signs in use at Harappa show strict similarities to those of the later Indus script. Moreover, at Harappa, in the first centuries of the 3rd millennium, the number and complexity of the signs traced and scratched on pottery containers further increased. They also began to be used in combinations of 2 or more signs. These combinations reflect the emergence of stable graphic conventions and the gradual crystallization of a recognizable script. In summary, the phase between the late 4th and the early 3rd millennium saw the transition of the same corpus of signs, from potter's marks traced on crude pottery vessels before their firing, to post-firing graffiti scratched on the surface of ceramic vessels, to monumental signs carefully engraved on stamps used to seal containers and rooms. In this process, we also see the transition from the use of single signs to their combination into short strings of a few signs. In my opinion, the passage of the same corpus of signs from the potter's marks, where they univocally indicated ownership only temporarily, to stamp seals, on which signs were used to permanently and biunivocally signify personal identification, can be regarded as the actual conceptual foundation of the Indus script. And we can firmly date this event between the end of the 4th and the beginning of the 3rd millennium, definitely before 2800 BC. This progression also mirrors parallel developments in sealing practices, which became increasingly formalized and integrated into administrative procedures. Although introduced around 2800 BC, as proved by the discovery of a single, unfortunately broken seal at Harappa, the typical Indus seals with an inscription in Indus script above a standing male animal were already in use throughout the greater Indus Valley by at least 2600 BC. Thanks to the stylistic periodization proposed by Mark Kinnear and corroborated by recent excavations, we can now divide Indus seals into chronological groups. This developmental sequence includes significant shifts in the orientation of figures, carving techniques, and the morphology of the rear boss, providing reliable markers for relative dating. On this basis, we should now be able to start reconstructing the geographic and chronological evolution of the Indus script in greater detail than before. According to the most recent corpus compiled by Brian Wells and kept up to date by Andreas Fulls, the Indus script currently counts just over 700 signs. To date, we have about 4,500 artifacts inscribed with signs of the Indus script, for a total of some 5,500 texts, either complete or fragmentary, making up about 20,000 sign occurrences as a whole. These figures immediately tell us that, even though we have a considerable number of texts, the length of the inscriptions is relatively short, with an average length between 3 and 4 signs. Most Indus signs have an abstract geometric shape, possibly recalling elements of the Indus architecture and material culture or abstract concepts, while others clearly represent human figures, animals, or vegetal elements. While many Indus signs are only minor variants of basic graphic forms, others show ligatures obtained by adding elements indicating grammatical or syntactic properties. Indus signs featuring different combinations of long and short vertical strokes were probably numerical signs, perhaps used to indicate quantities or dates, possibly by combining decimal and octal systems. However, such long and short vertical strokes also occur in inscriptions on media whose intended use does not appear to have required the notation of quantities. Apparently, stroke signs were therefore not invariably numerical, but could also have been used to represent sound sequences based on homophony or in rebus-like grammatical constructions. This distinction between numerical usage in accounting records and phonographic usage brings the Indus script in line with multi-significance practices well attested also in other third millennium writing systems. If the total number of Indus signs is about 700, we observe a significant variability in sign occurrence by site. Over 500 at Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, between 100 and 150 at medium sites, and around 20 to 60 signs at small settlements. In terms of occurrence, most signs of the Indus script are very rare, if not even unique. One single sign, sign 740 in Wells' corpus, alone accounts for 10% of all occurrences. The top 3 reach 20%. The top 6 reach 30%. The top 20 reach 50%. In most cases, these exceptionally frequent signs occupy specific positions at the beginning or the end of an inscription. In particular, sign 740 occurs mainly at the left terminal position, marking the end of an inscription. The reading direction of the Indus script was initially inferred from the paleographic study of the progression and overlapping of the signs in inscriptions scratched on ceramic containers. Using this method, the Indus script was found to be consistently written and, therefore, probably read from right to left. The right-to-left reading direction is now also confirmed by the statistical analysis of the segmentation of the inscriptions. Exceptionally long inscriptions, organized in more than one line, show that the reading direction followed a boustrophodonic progression, thus from right to left in the first line, from left to right on the second, and so on. However, some of these sequences of signs on more than one line have simply contained separate inscriptions, as suggested by the presence of specific signs at the end of the first line. This is the case, for example, of this square seal from Mohenjo-daro, which bears 17 signs arranged in 3 lines, making it the artifact with the largest number of Indus signs on a single surface found to date. Statistical analysis of sign position and affixation suggests that the 3 lines constitute 3 distinct sequences, either forming a single continuous text or conveying discrete informational units. I have begun to think, however, that this dichotomy between reading from right to left and reading from left to right may not have been so strict or important. Given the symmetry of many signs and the brevity of the inscriptions, a trained scribe could easily read them in either direction. The use of boustrophodon progression also facilitated an inverse reading direction. Now, rather than discussing in detail the internal organization of the inscriptions, the syntax and grammar of the Indus script, which I will discuss at the end of this presentation, I will present the archaeological and anthropological interpretation of the Indus inscribed media, their discovery contexts, and likely uses. In fact, I firmly believe that we cannot separate the statistical analysis of the inscriptions from the archaeological contextualization of the inscribed media. The most common inscribed objects in the Indus civilization are by far highly standardized stamp seals, which account for more than half of the inscribed media. Stamp seals made of high-fired steatite are one of the most distinctive productions of the Indus civilization. Indus seals are squarish in shape and have a hemispherical, perforated handle on the back, used to string and hold the seal. They were consistently engraved, following a specific compositional syntax, with the profile image of a single standing male animal, sometimes represented in front of an enigmatic object, and nearly always below a short sequence of Indus signs carved as to be read correctly only after being stamped on clay or other soft materials. These icons were selected among a specific set of about a dozen animals, real or imaginary, including, in order of increasing frequency, the tiger, the wild water buffalo, and the Indian rhinoceros. Different species of wild goat, the Asian elephant, and the zebu. Of particular importance is the Indian bison or shorthorn bull. This animal, in fact, characterizes the absolute majority of Indus-type and Indus-related seals found outside the greater Indus Valley, suggesting that it was the symbol of Harappan merchants engaged in external trade. In addition to real animals, the Indus seals also include imaginary composite creatures such as three-headed bovids, and what Massimo Vidal and I have called the Harappan chimera. The most common and iconic creature represented on the Indus seals is the so-called Harappan unicorn. Harappan unicorns are depicted as humpless, bull-like animals with a single sinuous horn protruding unnaturally from the top of the head. They are always represented standing in profile with only one ear raised, a prominent eye, and a raised rounded muzzle. Like all the other animals on the Indus seals, the unicorn is also always gendered as male. In the beginning, most scholars considered the unicorn to be just the distorted representation of a real two-horned bull represented in profile, with the two horns perfectly superimposed, as bulls were rendered in Mesopotamia. However, in the Indus imagery, other bovids or goats are always realistically represented with two horns. Moreover, evident differences in the rendering and shape of the animals and their horns also exclude the possibility that a few seals with the unicorn as a component of multi-headed creatures could have represented the same two-horned animal in different poses. Ultimately, the hypothesis suggesting that the Harappan unicorns were fantastic creatures with a single horn is confirmed by the discovery, at several Indus sites, of small terracotta figurines of bull-like animals with a single horn, very similar to those carved on the seals. These figurines clearly represented an animal other than the Indian rhinoceros, the figurines of which are completely different from those of the so-called unicorn. This evidence indisputably demonstrates that, during the second half of the third millennium, this fantastic beast was conceived by the Indus people as an actual unicorn. Exceptional Indus seals were also engraved with simple narrative scenes, probably related to religious and mythological beliefs. In this context, it is critical to notice that, in terms of frequency, the unicorn characterizes the absolute majority of seals in all Indus sites, with a mean frequency of nearly 80%. Despite the large number of seals discovered at Indus civilization sites, their function has long been debated. The number of clay sealings, which are impressions of seals made on clay lumps to close doors and containers for administrative purposes, is, in fact, much lower than expected if we compare the Indus civilization with contemporaneous contexts in Western Asia, where clay sealings are found by the thousands. Instead, we have only a couple of hundred clay sealings in the entire greater Indus Valley. This disproportion has led scholars to speculate widely. After nearly 2 decades of studying Indus seals and their impressions on clay, I am pretty confident in saying that stamp seals were primarily used also in the Indus civilization for the local administrative control and management of storerooms and stored commodities. We also know that seals were also used to control the manufacturing process of complex craft productions, like the stoneware bangles, which were eventually engraved with a short sequence of tiny Indus signs. Seals were used to create small tokens, probably to delegate sealing rights. Recent research suggests that these tokens functioned as formal credentials granting temporary authority, enabling individuals to authenticate goods or spaces on behalf of institutional offices. To understand the use of seals in the Harappan culture, It is also important to note that almost all of the clay sealings had the part of the seal with the inscription while stamped and legible, while the animal icon was rarely recognizable in its entirety, being covered by other impressions, obliterated by fingerprints, or simply not impressed at all. Therefore, in the administrative system of the Indus civilization, the inscription on the stamp seals appears to have played a central role, while the iconography was not equally important, or most likely it performed primarily a function of visual identification of the seal user directly from the object, not from its impression. After seeing what they were used for, let's now see who used seals in the Harappan world. We have already noted that, despite significant variability in size, stylistic treatment, and carving quality, the Indus seals strictly respected a dogmatic set of basic rules in terms of raw material, morphology, formal composition, and iconography. To understand this exceptionally consistent design, I deconstructed their features and compared the resulting patterns with those of Mesopotamian cylinder seals, which are known in greater detail. In Mesopotamia, cylinder seals were used to indicate personal identification and ownership through a combination of different raw materials, iconographies, and, in exceptional cases, inscriptions. What is interesting to observe in this context is that there were no restrictions regarding the ownership of a cylinder seal. Anyone who could afford one could own one, or even more. Cylinder seals were used by men and women of a wide range of social statuses and occupations, including rulers and priests, soldiers and scribes, craftspeople and merchants, and even servants and slaves. Even the gods were represented with their own seals. In addition, we must note that their production, in terms of design and materials, was not legally regulated, except for the use of specific raw materials and iconographies that in some periods and regions were exclusive to the royal family. Consequently, cylinder seals reflected the personal tastes and preferences of their owners, leading to the spontaneous multiplication of what, in modern economic theory, are called brands. If we analyze this production model using the modern theory of commodity branding, the production of cylinder seals is perfectly described by a situation of competition, a system that involves a large and ever-increasing number of components that are functionally comparable, but as much differentiated as possible in style and quality. For example, this branding strategy regulates the production of modern business cards. If we apply the same theoretical model to the Indus seals, with their limited number of standardized iconographies and almost exclusive use of high-fired steatite, instead of a situation of competition, we define an unbalanced form of oligopoly, which occurs when, in a system based on a limited number of components, one of these has the absolute majority of the occurrences. In our case, the absolute majority component was, of course, the unicorn. An unbalanced form of oligopoly is intrinsically unstable and, unless there are rules and procedures that protect or justify the presence of the minority components, it tends to suddenly collapse into a cartel or a monopoly. Evidently, this is not what has happened in the Indus civilization, where the components represented by the different iconographies remain active with the same general, unbalanced occurrences for almost 1 millennium. We must therefore assume that they did not represent competing clans, as initially proposed in early scholarship, but rather cooperative roles integrated in the same socioeconomic system. In summary, Indus seals seem to have functioned more like modern corporate ID badges, which identify roles that are not competing, but are integral parts of the same socioeconomic system. In this sense, a comparison can also be proposed between the iconographies on the Indus seals and the emblems of the guilds of arts and trades of medieval Europe, which, although having different economic relevance, were all part of the same economic system and did not economically compete with each other. The next question is obvious. What were these roles represented in the Indus seal? As I have already anticipated, based on its almost exclusive appearance on the Indus-related seals found outside the Indus Valley, which were mostly manufactured locally in different regions of Western and Central Asia, we currently believe that the Indian bison, or short-horned bull, was the symbol of the Indus commercial entities operating in external trade. As a consequence, and by extension, the unicorn, by far the most common animal on Indus seals within the greater Indus Valley, might have been the brand of the most numerous bureaucrats in a proto-urban context, small-scale accountants responsible for the local administration, taxation, and duties. In the later centuries of the Indus civilization, rectangular and iconic bar seals bearing only Indus script inscriptions were introduced, possibly reflecting either a rise in literacy or a reform of bureaucratic roles previously expressed through animal iconography. Cylinder seals are very rare in the Indus Valley, but hybrid examples combining Akkadian themes with Indus materials, techniques, and script show that Indus merchants adapted Near Eastern glyptic conventions, likely producing such objects either for use in Mesopotamian administrative systems or for foreign-oriented contexts within the Indus Valley. Round stamp seals, evidently derived from the standard square seals, are extremely rare within the Indus Valley but become common across Mesopotamia, Iran, Central Asia, and the Gulf from 2200 BC. Morphometric analysis of the round seals indicates distinct locally produced series. Their synchronous adoption across all regions integrated into Indus-related exchange networks strongly suggests the implementation of a standardized, superregional administrative device designed to regulate external trade through shared iconographic and procedural conventions. After the seals, the second most common medium bearing Indus script were pottery containers. Single signs or short sequences of signs were traced onto ceramic containers before or after their firing. In exceptional cases, inscriptions were also painted on vessels. Such inscriptions may have indicated ownership, but also information about the jar's capacity, its content, storage, or may also have had apotropaic meanings. It should be noted that this handwriting did not lead to the eventual development of a cursive version of the Indus script. In addition to seals and ceramic containers, many other objects were inscribed by the Harappans. Inscribed wooden molds were used to stamp small ceramic containers before their firing, as well as tiny faience tablets or tokens and several types of terracotta tablets. Inscribed tablets were exceptionally made also by casting copper into a mold. Inscriptions were also engraved on steatite tablets and highly standardized copper tablets, on ivory rods, and on stoneware bangles. Other objects, such as metal tools and weapons, may also have been occasionally inscribed. A unique example of inscribed objects in the Indus Valley is a plano-convex lead ingot from Rakhigarhi, inscribed with Indus signs on both faces. In the Harappan world, inscribed media were nearly always small objects with tiny, short inscriptions that were visible only as the result of voluntary, personal interactions. The sole exception to this miniaturistic world of private inscriptions is the 3-meter-long signboard, found just outside the monumental entrance to the citadel of Dhalavira. This large inscription consisted of 10 signs, each about 40 centimeters high, made of sintered gypsum inlays set into a wooden panel. To summarize, the archaeological contexts and the range of inscribed media indicate that the Indus script functioned primarily within direct socioeconomic and administrative interactions. Its consistent association with seals, containers, tools, and other objects linked to production, storage, and exchange suggests that writing was used to encode information related to identity, ownership, authorization, and institutional control. Rather than serving for narrative or commemorative purposes, the Indus script appears to have operated as a practical communicative tool embedded in routine economic and administrative practices. Over the past few decades, scholars have reached a general consensus that the signs of the Indus script can be conveniently divided into content-related morphemes, which convey the main semantic information, and function-related morphemes, which appear to serve grammatical or syntactic functions. Nevertheless, the nature of the content-related semantic morphemes remains a subject of considerable debate. Citing the persistent brevity of the inscriptions, the high proportion of non-repeating unique signs, and the apparent lack of significant structural variation over an extended chronological span, some scholars argued that the Indus script constituted a set of non-linguistic ideological or emblematic markers, such as heraldic or ritual symbols, used for religious or social purposes. Others suggest that the Indus script was used within the administrative and commercial domain of the Indus civilization, conveying information through standardized sign sequences and positional conventions without recourse to linguistic syntax. These non-phonographic interpretations of the Indus script have been strongly challenged by numerous scholars. Probabilistic modeling of sign sequences has, in fact, revealed structured preferences for certain signs to appear in specific positions, suggesting a functional division paralleling syntactic order in natural languages. Andreas Fulls estimates that the average inscription length and the sign frequency distribution suggest a script with limited grammatical affixation, closely resembling logosyllabic systems such as or three-period cuneiform and likely suited to encode personal names, quantities, and economic administrative information, including professions and socioeconomic roles. The adaptive use of the Indus script across diverse geographic and cultural contexts seems to strongly indicate its function as a language-based writing system, rather than a symbolic or purely emblematic code. Indus inscriptions on locally produced stamp seals found in Bahrain and southern Mesopotamia frequently exhibit non-canonical sign sequences that diverge from those recorded from the core Indus Valley corpus. In particular, this evidence may reflect the adaptation of the Indus script to encode names and lexical elements in Amorite, a West Semitic language attested throughout southern Mesopotamia and the Gulf during the late 3rd and early 2nd millennia BC. To conclude, the Indus script represents a unique experiment in writing, deeply rooted in long-term regional dynamics. Recent models emphasize the structural flexibility and functional adaptability of the Indus script, situating it firmly within the typological family of practical, language encoding scripts used in the Bronze Age. Understanding it requires integrating paleography, archaeology, and socioeconomic analysis in a team-based effort that, unfortunately, has not yet been attempted. My presentation is over. I hope it was interesting and informative. I thank Andreas and Samara again for this opportunity, and please feel free to ask any questions. I will do my best to answer.